top 10 black people who beat the system. Brown hung upside down inside the small box, unable to move a muscle. His blood sped to his heart, causing it to beat harder, and the extra weight on his lungs was unbearable. He could feel life slowly slipping away. Then came the unbearable cramp pains. Blood had completely drained out of some limbs. Still, he couldn't make the slightest movement because death awaited him if he was found out. In today's video, we will explore the daring tales of 10 black people who, through bold subterfuges, beat the system that limited them. Number 10. William and Ellen Craft. In 4 days, a black slave couple from Makron, Georgia, journeyed what's called 1,000 miles to freedom in the most daring way. Ellen had a unique skin that made her look white, while William retained his dark brown colour. Together, they hatched a plan to see them walking together as free people and breathing the fresh air that the North offered. On December 12, 1848, the planned date for their escape, Ellen's hair was cut short and her right arm was upheld in a sling. To ensure this disguise was more effective, Ellen advised William to wrap her face with bandages. Ellen wore a pair of men's trousers, green spectacles, and a top hat. Now, the look was complete. Ellen was an injured white man, and William was her, or should I say his, slave. They knelt, prayed their hearts out, and set out that same day. It was a pulsating journey for the couple, who, at every moment, was scared to their wits, worried that they would be found out and sent back into the misery they were escaping. On the first train they boarded, Ellen realised that the person next to her was her master's dear friend, who had often visited the family to recognise Ellen. Her heart raced widely. Fortunately, the old man couldn't recognise her. Then came a time when a train conductor refused to let the young, injured master and his loyal slave board a train because he wanted their signature first. The couple were uneducated, as with black slaves, and were helpless at this point. Luckily, a friendly captain they had met on the way vouched for them. Yet again, William was almost whisked away when a white woman mistook him for her runaway slave. Eventually, the couple arrived in Philadelphia, and their joy knew no bounds. They were assisted by the underground abolitionist network and taught how to read and write. After 2 years, the couple fled to England when slave hunters arrived in Philadelphia asking after them. They bore 5 children and lived free for the rest of their lives. Number 9. Robert Smalls. At number 9 is Robert Smalls, the man whose bold trickery convinced Abraham Lincoln that African Americans could serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. When Smalls was growing up, his mother deliberately made him experience the terrible ways that field slaves were treated. Those memories hardened his tender heart and would be the sole motivation for his daring escape years later. In late 1881, Smalls found himself as part of the small crew whose task was to steer the CSS Planter, a Confederate ship, through the waterways of Confederate states and deliver supplies along the way. Smalls worked directly with the ship's captain, as he was the only crew member who knew the waterways like the back of his hand. En route, Smalls devised an escape plan with his fellow crew members. Convinced of its success, all they had to do was wait patiently for the opportunity to present itself. On the evening of May 12, 1862, the CSS Planter docked at a pier below General Ripley's headquarters. The captains went ashore, leaving the ship in Smalls' trusted hands. Unknown to them, Smalls had chosen this location to launch his escape plan. The planter's captain granted his request that the crew's family visit them on the ship, but on the condition that the families must leave before dawn. As soon as the families were on board, Smalls wore the captain's uniform and steered the ship off to freedom. Smalls had meticulously copied all the necessary signals to pass through Confederate harbour ports. The planter sailed past without a hitch. Smalls provided the right signals at each port with the right gestures, fooling Confederate onlookers. Smalls sailed the ship towards the Union's Navy blockade that lay 7 miles away. The Union forces celebrated the brave escapade, while Smalls was enlisted to work with the United States Navy as a civilian. Number 8. Henry Box Brown. Henry Brown, nicknamed Box, was a former Virginia slave whose daring 27 hours of escape from slavery became the talk of the town. Here's how the story goes. Brown was married to a fellow black slave called Nancy, with whom he had 3 children. A tobacco factory owner later hired Brown out, and he had his family come live with him in a little shack. However, Brown tried his best to convince his wife's owner not to sell her. He even considered paying for her freedom, and the deal was underway. But Brown met the shock of his life when his wife and children were sold by her dishonest master. Not to mention that Nancy was pregnant with their 4th child. The horrid slap of hopelessness and betrayal inspired Brown to plan his escape. He secured the help of a free black and a white shoemaker who felt sorry for him. Brown's famous plan was to mail himself in a small 3 by 2 feet box from Virginia down to Philadelphia. The claustrophobic adventure lasted for 27 long hours. Along the way, Brown's box was placed upside down, and he had to stay in that position for close to 90 minutes. His blood sped to his heart, causing it to beat harder, and the extra weight on his lungs was unbearable. However, he survived. His desire to live as a free man defied the pangs of death that crept in slowly. Not Brown, he was determined to escape his hopeless fate by all means possible. And he did. He arrived in Philadelphia safely and would go on to reenact his escape as entertainment. Number 7. Frederick Douglass. On September 3rd, 1838, this great African-American abolitionist fled the South on a train bound for the North. This wasn't the first time that Douglass had attempted an escape, but unlike the first, he succeeded this time. Before his escape, Douglass fell in love with a free black woman named Murray. Her social status enlivened the possibility of freedom in his heart. Douglass dared the consequences and believed that he would attain freedom this time. Douglass disguised himself in a sailor's uniform that Anna provided him. He also had the pass of a free black seaman in his possession. The only problem was that the identity in the past was far from what Douglass looked like. He admitted his uneasiness when one of the train's conductors approached him and asked for his pass. The conductor looked critically at the scared black man before he went his way. Before the journey ended, Douglass also had close encounters with people who knew him well enough to figure out that he was running away. But he escaped them all. In less than 24 hours, Douglass was a free man. Number 6. Harriet Jacobs. In the 18th century, it was an extremely difficult feat for any slave to escape their master. Despite this, quite a few of them did run away to the far north, which offered automatic freedom. Not immediately, Harriet Jacobs couldn't get as far as the northern states. Rather, she hid in a tiny crawl space on the roof of her grandmother's house for 7 solid years. Before she ran away, Harriet had been abused by her owner more than she could count. The owner refused to marry her, despite having 2 children with another man. He wanted her all for himself as his sex object. but she began to refuse his advances, and he, fueled with rage, threatened to sell off her children the next time she put up any resistance. Harriet knew her time was up. She fled her enslaver's plantation in search of the freedom that she heard lay at the north, but she had no money and was constrained to stay in her self-made prison under her grandmother's roof. She would watch her children play around the property from the crawl space's tiny hole. Eventually, she got help from friends who bought her a train ticket bound for Philadelphia. Number 5. Jackie Robinson. On April 15, 1947, Jackie Robinson broke the baseball color line when he first appeared for Brooklyn Dodgers. Long before Jackie held his first baseball bat, blacks were segregated from major and minor leagues and could only play in the Negro Leagues. Jackie faced overwhelming obstacles in the early years of his career at the Dodgers. Several of his teammates conspired to sit out games that included Jackie. In contrast, he was called names by the opponents. Some crowd spectators demanded that he go back to his cotton fields. But Jackie remained focused, as he had developed a thick skin against their racist statements. Interestingly, before he was signed to the team, his manager Ricky had one requirement for Jackie. Was he bold enough not to respond on the heavy backlash that would be leveled on him? Jackie was appalled by this statement and replied, "Are you looking for a Negro that can't fight back?" Ricky replied that he needed one brave enough not to fight back. This reply became Jackie's strength. Jackie's newfound trickery to turn the other cheek and his exceptional skills made him an important figure in the history of baseball. His number 42 jersey has been retired in his honor, and Jackie's name graces the Baseball Hall of Fame. Number 4. Kodak. Kiedo Moray Jem Arwings Kodak, the young African guilty of committing 2 cardinal crimes against the colonial authority in his home country Kenya. Kodak lived in a time when the colonial government believed that Africans were born to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. It was in that generation that Kodak became the first Kenyan lawyer. The road to being a lawyer was never a smooth one for the young Kenyan. The British government had only allowed him further his education because they thought he would ply the familiar path of studying the social sciences. However, after 1 year at the University of Southern Wales and Monmouthshire, Kodak shocked the British government when he switched to law instead, the original plan. The colonial government back in Kenya was mad with rage. Adding salt to the wound, Kodak went ahead to marry a white woman. Surely, if the colonial government could pardon the first, he wouldn't go off the hook with the second. Kodak and his Irish wife were refused accommodation in the white area and were not exactly welcomed among blacks. Nonetheless, Kodak rose to become a reputable lawyer in Kenya. He was highly sought after by young and old because they had found a voice that could understand them. Kodak fought extremely racist impulses in the form of policies against his people. He once snatched 45 people from an entire village that was sentenced to death for supporting a rebel group. Number 3. Seretse Khama. In the life of every great man, there was a time spent in the tunnels, wallowing in the dark, only soothing himself with the tiny ray of light seen from afar. For Seretse Khama, the first president of Botswana, the tunnel was the disapproval of his marriage by his kinsmen and the South African white minority government that borders Botswana. Khama's crime was marrying Ruth Williams, an Englishwoman. His uncle had promised to end his life when he came back home. South Africa's apartheid system was still at its strength at that time. The white supremacy government in South Africa forbade Khama from ever stepping foot on South African soil and, more seriously, pressured the UK to ensure that Khama would never return to the Mafeking, the capital of Bechuanaland, the former name for Botswana. The British government yielded to the request, as they couldn't risk losing their business ties with the South African government. For 6 long years, Khama lived as an exiled prince in England. He was the heir to the exalted Bamangwato stool. Despite the tides against him, his people never chose another leader for themselves. They were determined to continue the Khama family's legacy. Seretse Khama returned from England a new man. He wasn't only concerned about his kingship, but the independence of Bechuanaland. In 1961, Khama founded the Bechuanaland Democratic Party, and in the 1965 elections, his party won. He became the country's prime minister. With this win, the agitation for independence heightened. A new constitution was introduced in 1965 that laid the groundwork for the country's independence. In September 1966, Botswana became independent, with Khama elected its first president. This was Khama's story, an inspiring journey that took him from his little Bamangwato town to England and then back to Bechuanaland and emerging as its first president. Number 2. Ron Stallworth. Ron Stallworth may have been the smartest black detective of his day. If you've seen Spike Lee's 2018 film Black Klansman, the name is bound to sound all too similar. The story goes that in 1978, Ron chanced on a classified Ku Klux Klan ad that sought new membership for a new chapter intended to be created in Colorado Springs. Ron replied to the ad with a phone number and an address. Some days later, he was called by a Klan member for whom Ron posed as a racist who hated Jews, blacks, Mexicans, and Asians. Before the end of the call, the man requested a face-to-face meeting with Ron. The clever detective, hell-bent on infiltrating the Klan, sent a colleague, Flip Zipperman, in his stead. His plan worked perfectly. The Klansmen were unsuspecting of the Zipper man they thought was Ron, and the detective went in and out of their meetings for 9 months, wearing a wire. Later, Ron contacted David Duke, the Klan's Grand Wizard, inquiring about his membership status. Duke immediately apologized for the delay and promised to handle the matter himself. A few weeks later, Ron received his Ku Klux Klan membership certificate, with David Duke's signature smiling at one corner. Ron framed the certificate and brandished it on the wall of his office. Ron Stallworth became the first and only black Ku Klux Klan member in the Klan's history. Number 1. Harriet Tubman. Liberty or death. If I cannot have one, I will have the other, were the famous words Harriet Tubman said to herself before she freed herself from the claws of slavery. Tubman's heroic story began to unfold when she fervently prayed each night not to be sold at the break of dawn. Her health was declining fast, and it was evident in her body, which grew thinner by the day. Her master had determined to sell her off before she became worthless in his hand, but no buyer had shown interest. Then, one night, Tubman changed her prayers to demanding her master's death if his heart remained resolute to sell her off. In weeks, her owner, Brodes, died. But that wasn't the end of the tunnel for Tubman. Her master's brothers had a right to his estate, which meant that she was still at the risk of being sold. Realizing this, Tubman convinced her 2 brothers and made a run for it. Although the men would return later, as one of them would be a father in the coming months, Tubman had no choice but to return with them. But the dissatisfaction with slavery had filled her heart, and she escaped again. Tubman journeyed through a secret network known as the Underground Railroad, a system run by free and enslaved blacks, white abolitionists, and scores of other anti-slavery activists. Tubman eventually made it to freedom. She described her first few months in Pennsylvania as having felt like a touch from heaven. The sun came like gold, through the trees and over the fields, were the words with which she recalls the experience. More so, the very thing that would make Tubman extremely popular in the underground network was her courageous resolve to head back south and liberate slaves just like her. She went back and forth between the north and south for 11 years, rescuing about 70 slaves. At one time, a bounty for her head was up, totaling about $40,000, about $1.4 million today, even though no one knew who she was. White slave owners believed that a white abolitionist was responsible for the missing slaves. Tubman was nicknamed Moses, who led her fellow slaves to the Promised Land. She made her journeys during winter, when the cold was sure to keep the slave owners in the warmth of their houses. Faced with trepidation, these men and women envisioned the freedom that was before, and damned every hardship they encountered on the way. Did their stories intrigue you? Let's hear your thoughts in the comment section.